think I have been talking and no one could hear me.
I mean, I'm looking at the stream. It looks like there's a slight lag between your video and audio, but I don't know if that just appears that way.
Your audio, I think, is working fine. I think mine is now on. Okay, well, welcome back for the second time. Hopefully people can hear me. I think I had it on mute. If the audio doesn't work... All right, great. Thanks, Lisa. Is it working now? Hopefully. Anyway,
Yep.
We're here today. I have a special guest. We're talking about the academic job market. So I'd like to welcome Kaustubh here to talk with me today. All right, great. Lisa says she can hear us. So if you're new to this channel, my name's Chris. I'm a professor. I've been a professor for 5 years in geoscience. Kaustubh, who are you? Do you want to introduce yourself briefly?
Sure. Thanks for having me on, Chris. I actually sit, I think, 4 offices down from where Chris is at. I am also an assistant professor at the University of Arizona at the Department of Geosciences, and I've now been here for just a little over 2 years.
That's right. You started in August? You were fall semester. Yes?
Yeah, I think I officially started in August, but I was here in Tucson in June, so I got the full brunt of the heat moving, which was nice to be prepared, I suppose.
I know, that's
for what's in store.
You go to start a job and you're moving in when it's 110 degrees, which is not ideal.
Plus, moving from the Northeast summer, which is like gorgeous. So,
yeah, that's true. Great. And you study paleoclimate. Do you want to give like a 1 or 2 sentence description of kind of what you're interested in?
Sure. Yeah, so I am basically a scientist who works with carbonates, type of mineral. So I work with carbonate rocks and fossils, and I basically use chemistry to try and figure out what those rocks and fossils can tell me about the environment and climate in which they were growing in from hundreds of years ago to millions of years ago. And the major motivation to try and do that is to be able to understand the machinery of the climate system in order to better assess where we're going to be able to head towards in the future.
Cool. And that's right, you were hired in 2018, 2019? So you've had like 2 years, but 18 months have been pandemic, basically, is what I'm getting at.
Yeah, that's right. I was hired in 2018, but then I took basically I said that I would join after completing my postdoc, and we can chat about that. But I was hired in 2018, but I officially joined in 2019. So yeah, I've spent more time as a professor under lockdown than a professor not under lockdown.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's the case that we've been in. So generally the way this works, I had a couple quick questions because I'm sort of interested in people's path into science. And so a couple quick questions about you, and then we'll dive into today's topic and sort of discuss the academic job market. Does that sound good?
Sure. Sounds good to me.
So first off, I'm kind of wondering, like, when did you decide you wanted to make science as your career of choice? So not necessarily when you super got into science, but when you were like, yeah, I want to do this as a job.
Right. I think it was one of those things that kind of snuck up on me. I don't think I was, I wish I had a story that was like, I've always wanted to be a scientist since blah, 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 but that's not really the case. I come from a background where I actually did my undergraduate degree in chemical engineering, in South India. And midway through my engineering degree, I realized that this is probably not what I want to do. And I was basically trying to look for opportunities in other institutions that caught my interest, and paleoclimate happened to be the sort of the field that I chanced upon. And so, given that I was transitioning from engineering to this at the time seemingly esoteric field, when I moved over there and when I decided to go to grad school in paleoclimatology in the US, I think that was such a big leap for me that I was at the time was when I was like, okay, I'm all in, so, and to me, given how much I enjoyed and still enjoy paleoclimate and science in general, I think I was on that pathway ever since I made that transition as an undergraduate. And so, of course, there, and I'm sure we're going to talk about this. There are points where I was like, maybe I'm not going to be a professor, or maybe I'm not going to be XYZ position in, the US, and maybe I have to go back to India or other places. But I was always fairly sure after I made that transition that I would like to somehow be involved in science, and in particular this field of earth science, for my livelihood.
So walk me through your decision to go to grad school. Sort of when did you make that decision? What sort of influences you had at that time? And did you do that like with the idea of it being like a professor career, or did you have like less defined goals, I suppose?
Yeah, I think I had very hazy and less defined goals. I mean, let me take a step back and say I had really, I was lucky enough to have really wonderful mentors in India. And, at the start, it was kind of like, well, it'd be really cool to be in a position like them, and these were, at the time, both of them were scientists working at scientific institutions. They were not necessarily professors. Both of them subsequently became professors and were affiliated with universities. But so that seemed like a nice track and long-term goal to sort of look ahead towards. But at the same time, it was less defined. It was more driven by, wanting to make measurements and wanting to make progress in the field and wanting to get out and go work in the field. So I guess I didn't really think about that far down the line. And moreover, I had no idea about the differences in academic systems between different countries, or even in the United States, how different one academic institution can be from another. So definitely very less defined and hazy, sort of nebulous goals at the time. But I was fairly sure about the next step. So as an undergraduate, I was fairly sure that the next step for me would be to go to graduate school. I don't think I really looked into it past that. So at the time, it was just, this is how I'd like to proceed towards my next step. And that next step was a big one, was to basically get into a graduate school in the United States or somewhere, and basically be on a path towards ultimately getting my doctorate in that field.
So this question, I don't know if you can hear my toddler running in the background. This is kind of a purposefully broad question, but how would you describe your experience in grad school?
I think I can answer that broad question probably with one word that's probably also applicable to everyone else's graduate school experience. It was unique. And it was a unique experience that I think was made unique by multiple factors. The most sort of dominant factor of which was I was an international student, and I was learning the ropes about how to live in another country and on top of that, navigating the academic system and graduate school that exists in this system. And overall, to really address your question, I think I had a really lucky and fortuitous time in graduate school, in the sense I had really good mentors, I had a good support system, and I kind of just fell into it. And I made I had a really good system of friends and collaborators. And of course, there were lots of ups and lots of downs. But at the same time, overall, given what I've heard from others, and I consider my graduate experience to be really fun, actually. And, I definitely say that I wouldn't be here right now as a professor, as an assistant professor here at Arizona, if I didn't have that type of experience in Texas, which is where I went to graduate school for.
Cool. So today's topic, the academic job market. The reason, so I invited you on the show, and the reason I thought this would be a good topic is because you've sort of gone through this recently. So obviously you were hired 2 years ago, essentially right before the pandemic. So the last normal job cycle, if that makes sense.
Yep.
Because now all of the stuff that we're all doing is remote. So the last typical job cycle, which hopefully, perhaps next year it'll be back to a typical job cycle. So I thought it'd be good to talk to you about this because I think you could have some relatively fresh experience and perspective on this. So sure. The first thing that I wanted to do is sort of talk about what this job cycle looks like for people who don't exactly know. So it's run similar to the graduate admissions cycle, in the sense that jobs are advertised in the fall semester or the late summer. General application deadlines for these positions are anywhere from like late October, mid-October to January. So sort of late months of the year or very early of the new year. Interviews run, I'd say, anywhere from January to April, depending on how big of a search it is. They can go later in the year. And then most job offers, I think, go out in late spring. And then there's a negotiation period, and people, if they're very ready to start, they would start that coming fall semester. So that's what I did, for example. I think you mentioned you had another year left on a postdoc, so you deferred after you accepted this position. Does that sound, did I leave anything out?
No, that sounds exactly right. And we can talk more about it if you want, but that was like the golden year when I had a job lined up and I could go back to my postdoc and just focus on research and go at my own pace. But that's exactly how it transpired. I mean, I got the job in 2018 and then I deferred and I ended up joining in 2019. Yep.
Yeah, and I think generally our department deadlines are in January, like the first week of January, I think. So I think your search probably followed that schedule roughly as well. Sorry, go ahead.
I interviewed, I think my interview was in April, I think early April or late March. And I know I was one of the last ones to be interviewed. Mm-hmm. And I believe I signed sometime in late May or June, something like that.
Okay.
And I also realized I think there was another search out at the same time as mine, so maybe that slightly displaced, the normal annual cycle, perhaps.
Yeah, we had two searches running at the same time, and they were run by two separate committees. So there wasn't like workload conflict. Like, it was just a lot of stuff to do, but there was overlap in terms of like when we were running the interviews at the same time. So I think almost that whole semester we had 2 interviews a week because we had 2 jobs running. I think it's also useful to briefly describe sort of the types of jobs that we're talking about, and you can help me out in this because I'm probably going to forget one. But so the job that we're in, that we applied to, is a tenure track position. So it's a tenure track professor position, which was hired at the assistant level. There's some that specify assistant level, and there's some that specify any open rank professor position. There's also jobs which are non-tenure track teaching faculty positions. And so these would be like lecturers or senior lecturers. At our university, we call them professors of practice. So it's a separate track of job. And then there's a variety of positions which kind of fall into a visiting professor kind of position. So the middle category, those professors of practice, are permanent but not tenured. And the visiting professor positions are temporary, or at least intended to be temporary. And I think rarely, I don't really have an idea, but I think rarely turn into, or could turn into, semi-permanent positions. Is that roughly, did I roughly get that right?
Yeah, and I would also just mention, research scientists, particularly in places that are not necessarily teaching focused. Certain departments and also have research scientists where they can be, they're not tenured, they're non-tenure track, but at the same time they can be permanent staff, depending on various permutation combinations of how their salaries are paid. But that's kind of the research equivalent of the professors of practice, I suppose.
Yeah, there's certain institutions. So what I just described is universities, basically. And there's certain institutions which are research-focused institutions. So there's several in planetary science. There's a couple in earth science that I know of. And those are, so for example, like Carnegie Institution in DC has a department, 2 departments which specialize in earth science, and they're full-time research staff members. But then there's also places like Lamont Doherty at Columbia, which have research professors, which are they're not funded 100% of the year. They're funded some subset of that, and you raise money through grants and things like this. So I'm struggling to sort of properly categorize these. They sort of fall into what you just mentioned.
Yeah, and that's the other important thing here is that generally tenure track professors in the United States are typically paid only for 9 months. I think that was something that was kind of surprising for me to figure out in the first place as a graduate student. And I know several of my international colleagues are always kind of, really? Is that the case? That you're only paid for 9 months, but that is the case.
Yeah, it's it is surprising the first time you realize that, where you're like, wait a minute, they don't actually get paid. But I sort of, my mom was a middle school teacher, so she essentially had the same deal, and so I sort of understood that earlier than most people, I guess. So because she either taught summer school or just was not paid in the summer. So and then I should mention that these jobs can vary quite a bit depending on the institution you're at. So a professor position at a tenure track professor position at an R1 institution, where you're heavily research focused and you have a higher expectation of research and proposals and things like this, your teaching load is going to be lower versus if you are at a teaching centered institution or perhaps a community college, which is entirely teaching focused. So you could have very different distributions of work. So like the split between teaching research, if it's 50-50 or 75-25 or something, that split can vary quite a bit depending on where you are, which is not something that I realized until fairly late in my job market kind of path. So, Cal, I want to start off with a question. So when you were sort of a postdoc and you were first entering the job market, can you walk me through like what you were thinking at this time as you were approaching this? So like, did you have a strategy on what jobs you wanted to apply to? Did you have a clear idea of like where you wanted to end up in terms of like institution? Like what were your goals like?
To be very honest, I guess my goals were a mixture of all of those things that you mentioned, where it's kind of like, where do I want to end up? Can I even cut it? Does it even, make sense for me to apply to a position that was advertised at, say, Berkeley, for example? That's such a long shot to even think about something like that. And also a question of, trying to navigate what is startup. These are things that I just kind of heard and like didn't necessarily know what they really entailed. So it was about 50% of that, of all of those aspects. And another 50% was, if I don't find a job here in the United States, I'm going to have to leave. So there was that as another 50%, dominating the thought process of trying to find a job in academia and try to navigate academia. So I had never really ruled out leaving academia and trying to find an industry job. And in fact, I think during my fourth year of my PhD, I actually interviewed for a biostratigraphy position in an oil company. I just said, you know what, I'll give it a shot, and I ended up not getting that position. But it was a fun thing to do, I guess. But really, it comes back to that 50-50 mix of trying to make sure that you find something to be able to stay in the country, and at the same time trying to be able to find something that suits who you are as a scientist and who you want to be in terms of academia in the United States. So, and this mix of 50-50 got a lot different as I started to progress in the years of my postdoc, and as my kind of F1 OPT visa started to dwindle, because you typically, for international students, you come in on an F1 visa that gives you permission to stay here for 5 years. And thanks to actually the Bush administration and then supported by the Obama administration, you get up to 3 years if you're in a STEM field after your F1 visa to basically work on a postdoc and things like that. So in year one, I was a little more specific, I should say, in terms of where I wanted to target. And then years 2 and 3, I went a little more broader. But when it comes to what I was trying to prioritize, even in a market that was obviously better than right now, given COVID, so this would have been 2016 to 2019, I was still pretty much applying to whatever I could find that would kind of fit what I wanted to do. I was fairly sure that I wanted to stick to a research university, so I did not want to necessarily I didn't apply for any sort of small liberal arts colleges. Those are another thing that I didn't necessarily know what that was as an international student. But then when I kind of figured out that that's more heavy on the teaching side, or even community colleges more on the teaching side, even though I really enjoy teaching, I knew that if I wanted to stay here in the United States as a scientist in academia, I would rather be more sort of suited towards the research side of things. So I was broadly looking in the R1 and R2 categories.
So do you think at that time you had a clear idea of what the job market looked like what the landscape was like?
That's a good question. In hindsight, I would say I had a decent idea. I could have done some things now that I think of that might have broadened that. And to be specific, by now, hasn't really changed since the third year of my applications in the job market. But in my third year, I did a lot more that I felt like, wow, I should have done this in my first year of the job search as well. But when it came to the landscape, I think the landscape is dictated by where you're going to look to find jobs. So you're kind of biased to that. What are the sources that you're trying to see? And I'm happy to get into that. But your landscape and the picture of what you think the job market is only as good as the sources that you're able to find where jobs are listed. Would you agree with me on that?
Yeah, I mean, you have to really like go searching for them, because it's such a there's such a like diverse like set of where people advertise and stuff like that. So there's some standard ones, but then there's a whole lot of niche, I think is perhaps a good term, places that people advertise. I was more sort of wondering, did you, I'll cut to the chase. Did you have an idea of like how many applicants were there for each position?
No, not at all. I knew it was super competitive, but I had no idea.
Yeah.
And I got an idea only after I got this job, and I talked to people like yourself and some other people, and I realized how how much I underestimated the number of people applying for jobs.
Yeah, and you've subsequently been on a hiring committee yourself, so you sort of have
that's right
an additional layer of perspective, I guess.
Absolutely, yes.
Give me 1 second. My printer just like activated, so I need to turn it off.
No problem.
Sorry, I could hear it in the background. It's like making this big, is like taking off into orbit or something.
I could hear it too.
So similar to that, where you're thinking about what the job market's like, did you have a clear idea of like what being a professor would be like?
Somewhat. I anticipated some of the things, and it's fairly, the things that I anticipated have held up fairly well, I would say. But other aspects, I think, I wouldn't say I was ill prepared, but there were certain things that were surprising and things that I definitely had to, learn on the fly.
Yeah. So like, did your picture of that when you were on the job market match, like how closely does it match your idea of being a professor now that you actually are a professor? Like, were you totally off base? Were you like, not bad, somewhere in there?
Yeah, somewhere in there. I think it varies for different types of things that the job entails. So certainly for things like teaching and say research, running my lab, those are certain aspects that I was kind of like, yeah, okay, I fairly decent idea. But then there are other things like administration type stuff, mentoring, things that come up with finances, for example, or proposal writing, where I didn't necessarily realize how institution dependent some of these things can be. And I didn't necessarily know how non-level the playing field can be, even in the United States, particularly as a foreign student, you kind of, at the time when I was applying, right, all you can see are websites. You can't visit, you don't know. And so the US becomes very homogenous. And United States academia, what you view and perceive it to be, is also homogenous. And that kind of carried forth, of course, that got a lot more detailed and nuanced as I was a graduate student and a postdoc in the United States. But that carried forward. And that was a surprise, like, coming here and being at different institutions before that, to see the sort of the variance between institutes when it comes to all of these different aspects. That was something that I think I was way off of in terms of perceiving and navigating sort of that particular landscape of like how you deal with staff, admin, finances, all this stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll say generally I think when people come through for job interviews, I find there's kind of a wide variety in essentially how, like, there's some people who are like, yeah, I have a very clear expectation what a professor job is going to be like. Like, those people have perhaps been a professor somewhere else and they're switching institutions, and so they know what questions to ask. Like, for instance, are your faculty meetings cordial? Like, are there any like large arguments that you guys get into? Stuff that you might not think is important, but like could potentially be pretty important. Versus there's people who have no idea sort of what to ask in terms of like to get the details. I mean, obviously they know what to ask like generally, but they don't know the detailed questions to ask to find out what the institution to institution differences might be. For me, that took years on the job market. Like, my first couple of interview related things, like in-person or phone interviews or whatever, I was like, looking back on that, I was like, yeah, I completely was like either unprepared for something or didn't know what to ask, or like didn't, just was like not sure what I was doing. So how did that?
Yeah, I'd agree. I would agree with you. It's a little different for me because in my first 2 years of applying, I did not get any interviews. So, but in my third year, I got 3 interviews all of a sudden. And so I had to kind of learn that on the fly as well. So I don't know what you thought, Chris, but I probably, looking back, probably had some very naive questions that I was asking.
I mean, you seemed good to me. It was a while ago, so. How did that first year on the job market turn out? Or the first, because you had mentioned you'd done some applications still as a PhD student, but like what would you say your first real year on the job market? Like, how did that go?
It was exciting. It was harrowing, and it was anxiety-inducing. All of those 3 combined. It was exciting because I got recommendation letters requested, which I had actually also gotten even when I was a PhD student applying. So that was really exciting. But the frequency increased, which was nice. But I also never heard back, right? And we know that this is a chronic problem of institutes not really telling you that you didn't get the job, even at the letters stage. So that was super harrowing, and trying to figure out the sort of the calculus of that was definitely harrowing. But I guess what I realized from the switch from the sort of the first year of applying to the second year of applying was how much more I could really, I hate to say the phrase sell myself, but really how I could apply for certain jobs that I did not think I could apply for just the year before. That was something that I think I really grew to appreciate and to really, stretch out and put myself out there.
Mm-hmm. So did you make a lot of changes in your strategy in subsequent years?
That's a good question. I have all of my, statements and all my applications, and I went through that before this, interview here, and I don't necessarily see that there was a whole sea change of different strategies or approaches in terms of how I change things. Definitely, if you look at my first one and look at my latest one, there's obviously an evolution there. And the first one's definitely never going to be the best one that anyone writes, right? You just get better. Yeah. But at the same time, I don't think there was a sea change in the strategy of like the application sensu stricto. But what did change was, I started to realize that there is power in reaching out to people and inquiring about jobs and and that it's totally, it's not that I ever thought it was illegal, but it's totally legal to do that. You can go out, talk to people, ask them about the job, and if they are on the committee or not, I mean, they will tell you if they're feeling uncomfortable to talk about it or not, right? So that aspect really changed. I don't necessarily think that gave me a super advantage or anything, but it did give me a lot of insight into that process, and it did give me a lot of, let's say, closure for certain positions where I was like, why didn't I hear back? Or, I didn't necessarily have that, having a little bit of that insider information. So I would really advise people to, reach out to folks that you might know tangentially or peripherally, and even those people who are not necessarily associated with that job call or are on the committee or anything, but you can get a lot of information about the position and around the position as well by doing that. So I think that was something that I kind of realized was a powerful strategy.
Did you apply to a more broad range of jobs in the later years than you did that first year? Because you were saying you were a little narrow.
I think so. Yep. I definitely think I applied to more. Let's see, I have my numbers here. So in the first year, I applied, as a PhD, as my final year of my PhD, I applied only to 4 jobs, and I didn't get any of them. But in my second year, I ended up applying to 11 positions, and in my final year in 2017 to 18, I ended up applying to about 13 different positions. So definitely, both in terms of number, but also in terms of the breadth, definitely increased in terms of like what the calls were for, in terms of how I saw, how my research portfolio could fit under those calls. And it was almost like, there's no harm apart from a loss of time in applying to these positions. So that was a big strategy that I think I realized moving from the first year to the subsequent years.
Was your application packet roughly the same, or did you make any changes? So for example, I switched out a letter writer. I sent my packet to some people I knew at other, like who hadn't been my direct mentors, and was like, can you just give me some feedback on this?
So my packet didn't necessarily completely change. There were small tweaks here and there. So I had kind of like a cast of folks and mentors who I would rotate around depending on the position that I was applying to. So for example, if I was applying to a position that was like a climate dynamics position, then I would, put a reference who was a climate dynamicist. And whereas if I was applying to a more, say, paleontology type of position, I would, switch them out for someone who is a paleontologist. So those were the types of tweaks that I would make. And obviously I would cater it to each institution. I would look through their curriculum, the syllabus, the sort of the faculty that exists there. But the overall structure, it did morph, but it was not necessarily something that dramatically changed. And I will say that I had a lot of folks who took a look at it, mentors of mine and colleagues and friends of mine who took a look at it way at the outset. So that's partly maybe why it didn't change all that drastically. So it seemed to be a quasi-successful. I knew I was doing something right to get letters of recommendation asked, but I really don't know what changed when it came from year 2 to year 3, when all of a sudden I started getting these interviews. And in year 2, I got letters asked, but I never was able to make that cut to be requested for an on-site interview.
So did your opinion of the job market change in those 3 years as well? Like, did you have a moment where you said, oh man, this is going to be a lot harder than I thought it would be? Or...
Yeah. Yep.
It was that...
Yeah, definitely in year 2, towards the end, with time kind of weighing heavily on me, it was certainly like, it was not necessarily that, wow, this was harder than I thought it was. It was more in the sense of, boy, I need to get lucky. I realized how much luck plays a pivotal role in these aspects. And one of the other things that I learned to do over the course of my applications was to decouple my worth as a scientist and my worth as an academician from this process. So I would definitely say that learning to decouple that eased my mind a lot more. And by the time I was applying in year 3, I was fully ready to consider that I had to leave the United States and perhaps go back to India, look for jobs in India or other places as well. And initially that used to faze me as, oh, I couldn't cut it here and that's why I had to do that. But then I realized how much it's tied to luck, what the departments are looking for, this nebulous quantity called fit, which I still don't understand what that is, and several other aspects. So learning to deal with, okay, just because I didn't get asked to go to an interview doesn't mean my science is bad, was something that I learned, and I think that helped me a bit. So
yeah, I think that's a really important point. I think as you say, there's so much luck in this process that you could do everything right, and this job that you think you're perfect for, they end up just never even emailing you back. Whereas this other job that you're like, maybe I don't fit this job description as well as I think, like it turns out they love you and they interview you and they offer you a job. So I think that's really important, like decoupling yourself and your self-worth from like that whole process is a good attitude. So I have in my notes, I was like, we should talk generally about the market, just to sort of give people some sort of perspective. So, and you can help me because I think I have numbers, but I
Sure.
don't actually know how correct these are. But so in geoscience, for like a small niche subfield, I think we could expect perhaps 30 to 50 applicants for, say, a tenure track position. For a broadly written ad that's just like geoscience, it could range, it depends on the institution, but it could range anywhere from, say, 100 applicants to 200 applicants. I have a friend who's a biologist at Berkeley, and he says for their tenure track positions, they regularly get 800 applicants for each position. So I don't have any. Do you have any other data points from like other fields or disciplines or things, or my numbers wrong? Or
no, I think that's accurate. I'm again glad that I'm not in a biology department, and I'm not a biologist. But I think that sounds about right. I can also say, like from my friends in engineering, I think engineering particularly gets a lot of international applicants as well, and which I'm sure other fields do, like biology as well. But I think engineering numbers are also somewhere up there. Maybe not necessarily as high as biology, but definitely higher than us, even for niche fields of engineering. So they're on the order of about 400 applicants, for example, is what I've heard.
yeah, so if you think about that, like the odds of any, if we just think of geoscience, the odds of any job search being in your favor are you're starting kind of at a low odds there, I suppose. So if there's something like 100 applicants, and you could help me out from the jobs, the committees that you've been on, but like, what would be the number of people that would get letters pulled? Like, is that 30-ish?
I would place it a little lower. I would place it, I think, more like 20, depending on the position and depending on the applicants as well. And in my experience, at least, this varies from position to position within the department as well, right? Because each search is different. And so the committee might choose to do things differently. And I like that the US academic system allows for that leverage and that flexibility depending on the call. But yeah, so let's say 100 probably goes down to about 25 roundabout for letters of recommendation.
Yeah, and then an interview list is somewhere around 5 to 10. It depends on the institution and on the department and on the call. It could be, it could be as low as 3 or 4 if it's a pretty small subfield, I guess. Most of the ones that I've seen are around 5 to 8, and then I've seen a couple hit 10. The really broad searches hit 10.
Yeah, that sounds about right to me. I would peg it a little on the lower side, like, as I've never seen 10 even at my previous institutions, but I've seen up to about 6 or 7 for certain calls. So again, it really depends on the field, I suppose. But yeah, that sounds about right. So what is that? That's about 5 to 10% of the original 100 that end up coming on site, or in today's world, having a Zoom interview.
Yeah. Although I would say, I think since we've done all this remote stuff, all the Zoom stuff, I think a lot of places have instituted like a middle, a less demanding Zoom interview that's like in between. So they would get letters and then they would do Zoom interviews, like an hour Zoom interview with perhaps 10 to 15, I don't know. And then a full interview. So for us, a full interview is 2 full days, 2 8-hour days, basically, where you're meeting with various people. And so they've inserted this miniature interview that's perhaps an hour long with the committee, just to get an idea of what people are all about and how they interview generally. So I actually think that's a good thing. I think having more people get FaceTime with interview committees, I think, is generally a good thing.
Yeah, I'd agree. And I think it's even though it might seem more taxing for the candidate, I think the candidate would also end up agreeing that maybe in hindsight, but the more people you talk to, the more information and more perspective you get about being in that department. I'll remember my PhD advisor, Terry Quinn, when I was talking to him about interviewing in general. I tell this to other folks who ask me, but you're interviewing them as much as they're interviewing you, right? Like, you want to decide whether you want to be at that department or not. So getting more FaceTime is absolutely a great way to get more insights into what that department is about.
Yeah. So did your goals change throughout your job market path? Like, when you started the whole job market, you were like, yeah, I want to be a tenure track professor, and that goal stayed the same? Or did you always apply to the same type of jobs, or did it change along the way? Or, how did your goals evolve?
I was pretty much open in terms of where I wanted to be, as long as I was able to do research that I'm interested in. So that was kind of the major criteria. And even in my first year of job application, I ended up applying to 4 schools, but one of them was an R2 and the other 3 were R1s. And so I was open to the idea of say, going to a place where I may not necessarily get a mass spectrometer, for example. And as the years went on, I think I definitely broadened my horizon in terms of the calls, but I don't necessarily think my goals changed. I was always, let me rephrase this. I think I was always into the idea that I would make do with whatever I got, and whatever I got depended on what was there for me to apply to. So in the second year, I tried to apply to certain things that I thought I was, well suited for, and that kind of broadened in year 2 with respect to year 1, and definitely in year 3 as well. But the goals never really changed. And, I would say even for those who have a one-track goal of being on the tenure track and applying to tenure track R1 institutes, let's say as an example, you have to realize that each place is different. Startups are different. The faculty is different. The philosophy is different. The ethos, the atmosphere is different. And so you're going to have to cater yourself and see how best you would like to fit in there, and see how best you're going to, be doing your research or whatever your goals are, if it's a teaching goal or whatever. So that definitely became something that I started paying more attention to over the course of those 3 years. And really, something that was key was location, where we were not necessarily tied to a particular place, my partner and I, but we definitely did want to go to a place that we thought that both of us would be happy in.
Yeah. So I do want to say, as we approach the end, if people have questions, we have plenty of time for a Q&A. If you have questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. So you sort of alluded to this already, but in the different steps, preparing an application, going through interviews, are there things that you would have done differently knowing what you know now? Like having been a professor, having been on some hiring committees yourself, are there changes you kind of wish you had done that would have perhaps improved your application or just made the experience better, or that sort of thing?
Good question. I don't think I can point to one definitive thing and say I should have done X, Y, Z. I would just say that you can only get jobs that you apply for. So don't hold yourself back. Wherever you are, whatever position you're in, how many ever papers you have or don't have or are coming out, I really think that those things are played up more than they actually are, especially coming onto the other side and being on a committee, right? Of course, all those aspects matter, and in today's today's academia in the United States, all those metrics, for better or for worse, they matter. So I'm not taking away from that, but at the same time, the fact is that an applicant will never get to know what's going on inside a committee meeting about the position that they applied for. So there's no point racking your brain on what they talked about, whether what they thought of your research or so on. So, after, of course, you want to get your network and your support group to read your application package and critique it as best as possible in sort of a safe space. But after that, I would definitely say that it's worth putting in your applications. It is a grind. You need to be prepared for getting several rejections. But once you get past that and you sort of get a formula for catering different aspects to different applications, like that would be the one thing I would change. I would have applied to a lot more schools in hindsight, in year 1, for example. So that would be the thing that I would say is just don't worry about where you are at, because the jobs are not going to wait, and you can only get a job or even put your name out there if you apply for those. So I would just say keep applying, and I understand it's not as simple as saying if you just keep applying you're going to get a job. That's definitely not the case, not how it works. But I'm basically talking to 2016 me and telling myself to not worry about what my image or my status or my identity is as a researcher before applying to jobs.
Right. Yeah, I think those early applications also do some to improve your later applications. So the fact that you're like going through and writing these statements, like people might think that they're not ready to apply to jobs, but I think that doing an application early on is useful, because then the following year when you think maybe I am ready for a job, like you have something to work from, and you say like, look, I wrote this last year on what my research goals are, and I have a much clearer idea, and I can refine the statement that I wrote last year, and I have a document, and I went through the exercise of writing a teaching statement, and now I have it's sat with me for a year, and I've stewed on it, and I have a clear idea of how I might want to write that this year and this cycle. So I think it is more work for everybody, but I think it's useful really to apply to different types of jobs and get applications out there, because it makes your later applications even more solid. Excuse me.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think that your first ever application is most likely not going to be your best application, and more likely going to be your worst application. So you might as well get it out of the way, right? That's kind of the idea, is get that out of the way. It's okay. You've got to start somewhere, and then just build on that and get feedback and be open to criticism and try to improve on that. I will also say another thing that I think made a difference in my applications is the type of positions that I was applying to. I don't know how much to place this. It's, I wish we could run a Monte Carlo simulation, but we can't, because we're dealing with statistics of small numbers here. But I really think that getting out one of my PhD papers, as usually happens, I got it out like a couple years after my PhD. I kind of felt that made a difference, but that could be me reading into something that doesn't actually exist. But there is a balance between focusing on writing papers and being too preoccupied with job applications in the future. So there is that balance, but at the same time, I think it's safe to say you can certainly err on the side of too many applications as opposed to too few.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I did. So my own numbers, I was doing perhaps 20 to 25 applications a year. And I was on the job market for like I was on 4 or 5 years on the job market. So it was like almost 100, I think I put out. And they're very, very different. If you the evolution of that packet from the first application to the last packet is like hugely different. And so I think people spending a lot of time on their packet and doing early drafts and sitting on it and like refining your ideas is pretty useful.
And would you say that your evolution was kind of linear in the sense that it progressively improved like over the years?
No, because say the first 2 years I wrote something and I didn't necessarily share it with enough people to get feedback, for example. And then the later years I was like, oh, I really need fresh eyes to look at this. And so I started like spreading out, and people would give me ideas on like things that I could change or improve or looked off or whatever. So that plus a combination of I just had more papers over time, I think was where my improvement came from. Yeah,
that makes sense. And on top of the application packet, I think one of the things, even though in my case all the interviews happened in the same year until I never had interviews, and then all of a sudden I had a couple of them. That was another thing that was kind of surprising to me, was how involved visits are and how involved interviews are. That was kind of like a sledgehammer. So as I did more and more interviews, I kind of was able to prepare better for them. And for example, like, make sure you carry a lot of water, make sure you don't, have that extra beer. Don't do that when they take you out for happy hour,
Yeah.
Every drop of energy that you can save it, right? Because they are draining for sure.
Yeah. My first interview, I would say, I bombed it because it was like, I had some expectation, and then I did preparation for that expectation, and that I was like not even close. Like the level of the intensity of like an interview, I was just not prepared for, and I was underprepared. So my subsequent ones, I was perhaps over-prepared. Like I tried to overcompensate, but I was like, yeah, I want to know the employment history of everyone that I'm meeting with, for example.
Oh yeah, Chris, I had your CV on my watch.
I mean,
actually, that's not true. That's not true. I made a mind map of everyone's, like their employment history, or like, where they had done their PhDs, and I had that on my watch. And so it was nice. Like just before walking into someone's room, I was like, oh yeah, okay, I remember where I'm at, because that's such a key aspect, right? I mean, academics love talking, particularly about themselves and their research. So, if you can get someone to talk and all you're doing is listening, that's a great strategy, in my opinion, for a successful interview. And then that gives you more information, and and to really ask those questions, whether you're in a place to ask those questions or not. You only get that by listening to someone talk in the first place. So
yeah, I made flashcards of the people that I was meeting with, and I was like, where did you do your PhD? What are some themes of your research? What is a interesting paper that you wrote in the last 3 years? And then I went and read it. So I would have like things to talk about. So I knew about these people before I met them, because my first interview, I definitely met people I had no idea who they were, which I would certainly. I would consider like, I don't know, I'm aghast at thinking about it now.
Right. Agreed.
So if people have questions, want to do a little Q&A, drop them in the chat, write your questions in the chat. I did get one sent to me beforehand, and so we can start with that one. So this year in particular is a tough year for job applications, right? So there were generally fewer tenure track positions open, because a lot of universities had hiring freezes, and generally were not approving like tenure track lines because they thought they were losing hundreds of millions of dollars and stuff. And as a response, there have generally been more non-tenure track positions. So there were perhaps temporary positions. They were like, well, we need to teach this class, so we'll open up a 1-year temporary position or something like that. So how do you think people should think about this market? Is it better to stay a postdoc? Is it better to take something is temporary? Is it should they broaden like the jobs that they're applying to? Like, what would you have some advice for people in that situation?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's a completely different landscape than it was 2 years ago, and arguably, this year is different from last year as well, and obviously next year is probably going to be quite different too. So I'll caveat by saying, what advice I might have may not necessarily be applicable broadly. But that said, I would, if I was in that type of position, particularly tied to like an OPT or something like that, I think the best thing to do is to broaden your search, and that might mean broadening it from, say, R1s to R1s and R2s, or to also community colleges or to SLACs, and to also try and perhaps think about whether trying to take up some of these temporary positions is going to help you in your trajectory. So what I'm saying is basically, now's probably a good time, given the market, to really think about what you want to do and where you want to go and what your goals are and what your trajectories are. So if it really comes down to, let's say you are gung-ho that you want to just do research, well, maybe it's time to think about research scientist positions, right? And for example, UTIG, the University of Texas Institute for Geophysics, that's not necessarily something that is as widely known as, say, Lamont Doherty or Scripps, right? But there is these institutes that are around that are tied to departments that support research scientists, and of course, it's soft money, so you got to raise your grants and so on. Like Oregon State has an extensive collection of scientists who are in that type of position. So maybe you have to entertain those types of positions and to go out there, because some of these places are actually hiring and they're looking for scientists all the time, even in today's market. Now, on the flip side, if you're more into, say, teaching, or if you want to go down a route where you'd like to be at a small liberal arts college, I know for a fact that there are several of those universities that are putting out these one-year visiting professorship positions and so on. So it would probably do you well to get one of those positions if that's where your trajectory, if that's where you want to end up. But there, I have to say that you probably don't want to give up a year or two of postdoc funding in lieu of a visiting scientist or a visiting professor position. I would be hesitant to do that. I try to always. This is the problem. I think our system kind of punishes us for being too good. So let's say someone who's in their first year of their postdoc has one more year, let's say of a 2-year postdoc. Let's say they get a job and they're asked to join the next year. I would try as much as possible to defer joining such that you get that 2 years of funding as well as that third year where you can be a visiting scientist. So exceptions, that's one of the nice things about American academia, is that it is not as bureaucratic as some other countries. There is flexibility. It might not seem like it. It might seem very rigid at the outset, but there's always flexibility up till the highest levels. So there's no harm in asking. So if you get offered a position, I mean, going back to your original question, Chris, if you get offered a position, should I take it or should I not? What can you do to maximize your current position and also the position that you've gotten? Try to maximize both of those aspects. And once you've been offered a position, remember, the ball is in your court. They want you there, they need you there, and your expertise has gotten you that position. So make sure that you try and extract this, especially in such a tenuous market as today. So that's kind of what I would say. And I'll just stop at that to just say, make sure you're not getting punished for being too good.
Yeah, I think that is a difficult question, because it has to do a lot with, what is every person's individual goal, what range of positions could they see themselves in, and I'd say, like, the job market is certainly not good, and it's not, even 2 years ago, 3 years ago, I wouldn't call it good. Like our discussion today has sort of been like operating in this system as it exists today, but I don't think, I'm going to speak for you, I don't think either of us would think that this is a particularly healthy system where there's
optimal system
where there's
Agreed.
200 applicants per job, so there's like systemic issues where we don't have enough jobs per graduates and stuff like this, and like enrollment numbers versus professorial numbers have diverged, and we could do a whole nother hour of like all the problems in this whole setup. But I think a good takeaway for me is to go back to what you said, where it's like try to separate yourself and your worth as a scientist or as a researcher from the actual job process, because it is significantly luck-based, and there's things in your control and there's things that are not in your control, and some of it is just like out of your hands.
Yeah, and let's not forget that also, that there's a pandemic that's still going on, right? And maybe those decisions of what you want to do or where you want to move on is really going to be led by, maybe your family member or your partner is sick, right? Or you have other commitments that you need to look into. And obviously family commitments is not a new thing since the pandemic, but it's certainly, changed our perspective of how we view that. So again, I'd go back to saying that you need to sort of look inward in terms of where you want to end up and where you think you'd like to be going towards. But at the same time, academia is not the end all be all. And if you're especially offered a job and you have some type of leeway or flexibility in terms of taking that or staying back, again, this is a time of crises. It's like you said, Chris, that this is not the system that either of us think is optimal. So you might as well ask for the world in terms of whatever you'd want, and try to squeeze as much out of any positions or any types of funding scenarios that you're able to get.
Yeah. So do people have questions that they want to ask in the chat? I haven't seen any pop up. I've made a couple pleas, a couple requests. I don't see any happening in the chat. Is there anything that I didn't bring up that you thought you want to pontificate about? Or anything you want to ask me? Cow. I'm asking you, Cow.
Well, yeah, I was going to say, I've got a couple questions for you, Chris.
Sure. We are a little long. I don't want to go too long, but
sure, I'll try and keep it short. I was going to ask you, what you went through a longer application period than me. So did you have any types of, and arguably in the same type of period that was not necessarily optimal, right, in terms of the job market? But what were your sort of criteria? I mean, you're now at, you're an assistant professor with a big group here doing all types of research. So was that something that you were always gung-ho about? You were always sure that you wanted to end up at an R1? Or did that process change over your application? Because in my case, like I told you, it did expand, but it wasn't necessarily that different from my initial motivations for application. But I was just curious, since you were on the market for a longer time.
Yeah, I think it was fairly stable. I mean, I was definitely more narrow in the first 2 years, let's say, where I was, perhaps picky is a good description of it. And so I limited myself. I didn't want to apply to certain places. They were all R1s in departments that I thought I could, they were high priority departments that I was like, what do you call it? Like heavily research focused, I suppose.
Sure.
And then as the years went on, I broadened it a little bit in the sense that it was down to R2s, but they still were not like, I kind of knew from the beginning, I was like, I don't want to be entirely teaching focused. I want to still have a pretty active research program. So for me, it was kind of, my other options were just leaving academia entirely. I saw myself like entering perhaps the private sector and doing sort of, data related jobs, like, things that still required PhDs, but data analytics jobs or something like this, where it was more research based. And so I knew that I do enjoy teaching, but I didn't want to make it my 100% full-time thing that I did. Mm-hmm. I think what I definitely did get more broad in was I applied to a more broad range of ads. So there would be an ad where it would be tangentially related to what I do. And I was like, well, I've seen plenty of people where, I've seen ads in the past where they were specific and they hired someone who I would say is not really a fit to that ad. They found someone else in the search that they liked more, I suppose. And so I was like, well, if there's this high variance in who gets hired versus the initial job ad, I might as well just start applying to a more broadly, so if there was a broad ad of like, we want someone who studies climate, I'd be like, well, technically I'm a geophysicist, but a lot of things I do are climate related. And so even though I think of myself first as a geophysicist, I'd be like, I'll apply to that because I study ice sheets, I study, climate stuff, so why not? Or some of the cluster hires that you see at universities where they're like, we're hiring people in 5 different departments, those are typically written pretty broadly. And you might think, they're not really looking for geoscientists, but I'll throw an application in. Maybe they are interested in one.
Yeah, I can definitely resonate with that too. Like, for example, I was applying for sedimentology positions, and I'm not a sedimentologist, but I work with sediments. But it's a bit of a stretch. But at the same time, whereas in my first year of applying, I was kind of like, no, I would never apply for that type of position. Right. Now, later on, I was like, well, wait a second, I could certainly show that I'm trying to fit myself into that type of position, and I have certain chops that I can bring to what they're looking for. And the thing being on the other side now, it's like, if you get good applicants, people take note, right? And they may not necessarily be the exact fit, but people's minds change, and you never know what's going to happen inside that committee meeting or inside that faculty meeting. So guess what? There's no point thinking about what they're talking about you or what they're going to say about or how they're judging you. I think learning to deal with that really also limits the stress. So at the same time, while broadening where I was applying to, also kind of learning that just don't think about why you didn't get some position or why you haven't heard. I think that's really the biggest lesson that I took away is to just not think about what could have happened, because it's not worth it, and you're dealing with really small numbers and small statistics, and if you want to keep continuing with it, that's one of the ways that I was able to decouple myself as a scientist from that process.
Yeah, I think you should spend exactly 0 time thinking what the committee's thinking was, right? So you should not waste any time thinking about like, what was their decision like, or what was their discussion like, or why didn't they like me, or anything like this. Like, there's just no use in that at all, basically, because it's there's a million things that go on in there, and a lot of it is random and a lot of it is luck based, and it's just like there's a million, it's
yeah, and it's not just use, right? It's detrimental.
Yeah. It's
actually detrimental process because it wears you down. It kind of erodes you, and so that is certainly something that I would tell 2016 Kaustubh and say, dude, you got to stop. Don't worry about that.
Yeah. So Lisa was like, have you found the stress to be mostly worth it? What kept you going when you were over a year into the process? So, I mean, I spent several years doing this, and I found it very stressful. And I was sort of at my limit, and I was ready to, had I not gotten this job, I was ready to like pull my parachute and exit to some other job or in the private sector or whatever, because I didn't want to go through another year on the job market.
In my case, I think when it came to dealing with stress, to be very honest, I don't necessarily think I was too stressed until my second year. That's when I was really feeling the heat, given the tie to the OPT. But my exit strategy was really not well formed, so maybe that helped me alleviate some stress, because all I was thinking about was, can I go back to India and try to figure out what to do, go live with my parents for a bit and figure out something. But I think one of the major aspects of going on was, mind you, in year 2 itself, I still didn't have any interviews, but I did get to interact with people through like the letters of recommendation, or to go talk with people at AGU about, this position. Oh, you had applied. And I realized that because I know several others who have been on the market for much longer than I have, that have quickly gotten, kind of tired of that. But initially, that helped me sustain that interest of like, okay, and I have to caveat that I'm an extroverted person and I enjoy dealing with social situations like that and talking about the market and venting about the market. And, so that process kept me going for a little while, but I'm sure it would have, gotten to me after some years. So that was over a year into the process. That's kind of what helped me through it, was to talk about it with my friends, to talk about it with my network, and to really complain about the process, because it is not an optimal process. But that helped me relieve stress.
So Lavanya has a question. Do you have suggestions on how to balance applying to several positions and writing up papers at the same time? I'm biased. I can't answer this question because Lavanya is my postdoc, so obviously my bias is that she writes papers. But do you have any answer to that, sort of generally, on how people might want to think about the market?
Yeah, so maybe I can expand a little bit on what I kind of hinted at in terms of writing up my PhD paper, for example, and then all of a sudden getting these interviews. So I think there's a balance. You need to have a balance, and you don't want to spend all of your postdoc time just applying to positions, because that's counterintuitive. Because if you do that, quickly you will realize that you're going to have gaps in your CV that people look into, and if you're not writing those papers, you need to be able to keep up with it. So that you need to have that balance. But one aspect that really struck me was so this, I can talk for my field. So I'm a paleoceanographer, paleoclimatologist, and I work on building geochemical records. And there were only a few papers that I was on where I had done that type of work. A lot of my PhD dealt with statistics, and it dealt with other types of sort of modern calibrations and observations, but not necessarily putting out a paleoclimate record. And that happened, and not that I was a slacker. My advisor might say that, but it was in review and had gotten rejected. It was one of those things that it kept getting bumped, and that process took about 2 years. So that's why it kind of leaked over into my postdoc, into my second year of my postdoc. And once that paper came out, I almost felt like I was, wow, like people paid attention to that paper coming out. So the kind of example, the reason I'm bringing up this example is that there might be definitely times where you should probably just drop all your position applications and just focus on getting that paper out. And I'm sure everyone knows what that paper means. It's a paper that kind of defines you. It's something that you're excited about, something that you want to get out. Or it could even be a paper that you're totally done with. You're like, I don't want to see this paper, but you want it out. I would say if you're in that type of position, get that out. Just get that out. Forego a couple applications if you need to, but get that essential paper out. And even if it's in review, you can talk about it. You can talk about it at the interview. You can mention it in your research statement. But there is something to be said about having the paper accepted. There's a big jump between that accepted and in review. Mm-hmm. So I guess that doesn't really answer your question in terms of, what are the suggestions on how to balance it. But going back to it, I would say get those papers out that you want to be identified with, like that help your identity as a scientist. Try to really focus to get those papers out. And by out, I'll also be broad here. If they're in a nascent stage, get them into review, submit them. But if they're in subsequent, if they're languishing in review, or you get them back from a high profile paper and you're kind of like, I don't know what to do with this, just get it out. Put it in anywhere, because if it's going to be definitive to who you are, that's going to make a difference.
Yeah, I think that's good advice. I don't have anything to add because as I say, I'm biased for this question. But are there more questions does anyone want to drop another question in the chat?
or if I did not address the points that you might have been asking, Lavanya, you can comment and let me know.
Did you have another one for me, or no?
I did, depending on time.
Sure. I mean, we've been going an hour and a half. We could wrap it up. You could ask another one. There's
Okay, I'll ask one last
Sure.
one. So, what I would consider what I do a little bit more niche than what you do, just in terms of how I perceive your identity as a scientist, as a broad geophysicist. Would you agree with me on that?
Sure. I don't know. I still feel like I'm a little niche, but I don't know.
I'm just trying to take a step back here in terms of differentiating between your thought process and my thought process during the application, time, where I guess let me take a step back. So for those of you who may not know, and I'm sure many of you do know, places like MIT or Berkeley or Princeton, for example, they're notorious for throwing out these job ads that are super duper broad. They will say, we are looking for a geoscientist, or we are looking for a geophysicist, right? And so I'm kind of wondering if, how much that played a role in me being successful, because to be fair, when I got these interviews, those were the, apart from two other ones out of my, 30 or so applications, 30, 40 applications, only about a handful of them, I think about 4 or 5 of them, asked for a paleoclimatologist. We're looking for something related with climate dynamics of past climate dynamics. And out of those, my success rate was a lot higher. But even something that was like climate dynamics, or even something that was sort of paleontology or sedimentology, or say or carbonate geochemistry, which is exactly what I do, but that's not what my science is, right? I didn't have that much success. So I'm wondering, for someone such as yourself as a geophysicist, what were the kind of the niche things that you were able to apply to, and how did you balance kind of these broad MIT type applications that are so daunting and intimidating, but they're right up your alley if they are geophysicists? Like, I even applied for a geophysicist position, even though I'm not a geophysicist, right? Yeah. So I'm kind of wondering on how you balance that, given your identity as a scientist.
So those really broad ads, where they're at Harvard, MIT, Princeton, they also aligned with places that I didn't really want to work, because I was like, I don't want to go to a place where off the bat I have a 50% chance of tenure. I'm like not interested in working 80 hours a week to maybe get tenure or something like this, and like completely kill myself with stress and anxiety and stuff. So I think maybe I applied to a position at MIT once, but like I generally avoided that tier of institution. So most of the things I applied to weren't that broad. But I will say, geophysics is broad, but at the same time is dominated by seismology. So the size of geodynamics in the geophysics community is pretty small, right? If you look at geodesy is dominated by people who do GPS, right? So there's not nearly as many people who study the gravity field in geodesy. So that is also a pretty small niche. It's much bigger in Europe, but it's not as big in the United States. So I would say I struggled where I was applying to, say, a geophysicist position. And I could probably tell from their faculty and who had retired recently that they probably wanted a seismologist. And I wasn't gonna have the greatest chance. I think why I did well in the job I'm currently in is they specifically wanted someone who does satellite gravimetry. Because it was a cluster hire where they were like, we're hiring 6 people, who all use satellite data, remote sensing data. And then of those 6, one of them was satellite geodesy, and one of them was like atmospheric, atmospheric precipitation or composition or whatever. Another one of them was like surface, using Landsat, for example, like what does the surface look like in drought areas versus not drought areas. So like this variety of positions all related to satellite remote sensing. And so I think this position was niche enough where the number of applicants were low and I was a really good fit for it, that I was like, oh, I obviously got the position, but like, I don't think, if people have one geophysicist in their department, odds are good it's going to be a seismologist. It's not going to be a geodynamicist. So that's kind of like the struggle that I had, where it's like, should I identify as a geodynamicist? Should I identify as a geodesist? Should I identify as a climate scientist? Like, what is going to get me the best bang for my buck, essentially? And I struggled with that for like years, and I still don't have an answer of like what I should have done.
Yeah, I think that's fair, Chris, because I think if, given your identity as a geodynamicist, I would place that as niche as a paleoclimatologist, right?
Yeah.
Like that drops to another tier below geophysicist or geochemist, right? So I definitely agree with you on that. And I had one last question that came up while you were talking about this. Did you ever consider international options for academic international, tenure track or equivalent options?
Not really. I mean, I was married, I got married in 2012, which was the second year, but I had been, I was dating my wife for a long time before that. So it was not something that we wanted to do jointly. And I don't think, because she has her own career and wants to stay in the career that she's built. So if I was single at the time, perhaps. I have a friend who essentially was did his postdoc in Europe and had a fantastic time. He was spent 2 years over there and didn't take a long-term position, but spent a term position, postdoc position over there, and enjoyed it quite a bit. So I think had I been single, I probably would have been more open to that. Yeah.
Fair. Yeah, that makes sense.
So yeah, we should probably wrap it up. It has been an hour and a half.
Okay.
But I want to thank you for joining my burgeoning talk show and discussing the academic job market.
I want to thank you for having me on, and I gotta say, I think this is a fantastic idea to talk more openly about these things that you cobbled together, not in a formally or informally. So having venues such as this, I think, are really will be really helpful.
Yeah.
I wish your channel was on applying, Chris.
You wish it was what?
I wish your channel existed when I was going through the application process.
Well, I only have 6 videos so far, so don't put too much weight on
Get
my
on
shoulders.
it. Chop.
Yeah, it's an interesting hobby, and it's there's quite a lot of work involved with the editing and stuff like that, but it's I find it enjoyable. It's been fun so far, so yeah. And I do like these long form where we actually get into a discussion and can talk about things in more detail. This doesn't fit really in a 5-minute kind of video format. So.
Right. Agreed. Yep.
Yeah. But thanks again. For the people watching, I would like to do this maybe twice a month, but obviously I'm not hitting that schedule yet, so we'll have to see. But yeah, if there's more topics that you'd like to hear about, you can put them in the comments. There'll be comments on this video after it finishes and loads on YouTube. But yeah, until next time, thanks again, Cal. It was a lot of fun. And I'll see you at lunch next week.
Sounds good.
Yeah.